It doesn't feel like a job what I do. It feels more like a public service, which I guess it is. Every shift brings new drama to the fold, more tears, more anger and frustration, more terminal despair at the world, but nothing leaps satisfaction, like genuinely helping somebody who's dangling on their last thread of life. I'm not saying that everybody I speak to is standing one-footed on a multi-story, but just to know that your advice goes some way to dealing with the shit in people's lives is incredibly rewarding. When I began volunteering at Action Helpline 6 years ago, I myself was wandering aimlessly through life. I responded to an urgent appeal for telephone workers, fielding inbound calls from desperate people. Some just needed someone to vent at. Others had just done stupid shit and needed advice. More than often, callers felt grateful to confess their misdeeds in a non-judgmental environment. One or two joked that I should become a priest. When I started, I was completely out of my depth. I barely knew how to deal with my own life issues, so how could I possibly divulge advice to others? One of my callers on my first night was experiencing dark thoughts because he'd managed to discover that his wife had been cheating, and I'd somehow managed to encourage him to stalk her new lover. On the flip side, I had managed to stop him from committing arson, so swings and roundabouts really. At the end of my first week, I gained my first jumper. A foreign man whose name I was refused had fallen into deep trouble with the sharks after a bad spate of gambling debts compounded with a penchant to not pay back drug lords he had wrung, not having anybody else to turn to. He spoke in broken English with a thick accent, and the little I gleaned from the brief conversation was that he intended to end it by throwing himself in front of a tube train, the subway to anyone not familiar with my English vocabulary. Despite my feeble protest, there is always something you can do. There are debt conciliators you can speak to. I woke to the news that the 40 horrified commuters had witnessed the gory mosaic left on the train window. Looking back, pointing the man in the direction of Ocean Finance was probably my dumbest move. 6 years on, and these events are thankfully incredibly rare. What's more, due to volunteer shortage and the threat of closure, Action decided to pay a small number of staff to remain, so this became my full-time job. My attitude towards helping those in need didn't change in the slightest just because I was now contractually obliged to do so. If anything, it emphasized my position of responsibility. For once, I had a calling in life, particularly when he came along. In my induction, I was told never to get attached to the callers. I was told to be patient, completely impartial, and utterly detached. I was advised never to empathize too heavily and warned against giving too much personal detail to anybody, no matter how familiar they may wish to become, but I accidentally made an exception for a gentleman who gave his name as Brett. I knew this to be a false name, but even if it were, I wouldn't be able to divulge it due to safety reasons and data protection. The first night Brett rang, I found myself to be carrying more than usual. Here was a man whose entire life had always been served with an extra side of shit. During our first call, our relationship became a series of nightly conversations. He explained how his father's sudden departure had left him and his mother alone, leading her to slide into an alcohol-fueled depression. She was unable to provide for Brett, who would spend most nights hungry. His mother soon passed away due to unknown circumstances, leaving Brett to an orphanage. Adult Brett fared no better, living a life tainted with drugs, unemployment, and eventually homelessness. Most callers are running away from things, debts, villains, gangs, their past, and Brett was no different. He had backed his way into a desperate amount of debt, and a spiral of heroin addiction left him seeing no way out. Why not move away? Start over and begin a new life away from London. Why must death be the only solution? I put to him when he confessed he was feeling this way. Because there is nowhere that I could go that I wouldn't find myself, he replied, an uneasy sense of existential dread filling the phone line between us. I've been fucking up my life for nearly 30 years, so I don't see why the next 30 should be any different. Then why the call, Brett? If nothing can be done, why are we discussing this? I just don't like the thought of dying with no one knowing who I am. At this point, I made the mistake of asking if he had formed a plan for suicide. I always ask this once the topic is raised to see how serious the callers are. It may sound heartless, but if you hear somebody banding the word suicide around, saying that they have been having these thoughts for years, but had never truly thought about how to do it, you know that these people can be easily dissuaded from the edge. Brett's plan was so detailed, it was as though he was calmly reading lines from a play. He had thought of where, when, how, what method, who would find him, and even what the weather would be. He prepared everything down to the most minuscule detail so that it was alarming to hear. He painted a picture of his bloody corpse so vividly in my mind that it was all I could do to remain impartial, until he said one fateful thing to me that changed the playing field entirely. I think you're genuinely the only friend I've ever had. Over the next few weeks, Brett and I forged a bond. Hearing him call almost every night gave me strength to know that he had survived another day. That he was willing himself to live gave me hope that there could be redemption for this man. I started to see him as some kind of twisted project, and as we spoke, I poured my personal information back into him. He had soon learned my name, about my family, my birthplace, my favorite foods, even the name of everyone I've ever fucked. Giving him such private details seemed to almost fuel him, and he spoke to me more like a close friend than a stranger. I gave him my mobile number so that he could reach me when I wasn't on the clock. Often there were nights that we wouldn't mention his plans for suicide at all. My car broke down on the way into the office today, I said to him one nondescript afternoon. I saw smoke pouring out from the bonnet, so I had to ditch it on the hard shoulder. Felicity came and picked it up. Felicity was one particular annoying bitch colleague of mine who would rather talk about her own boring marriage than spend any time on the phone. Brett laughed. He knew my feelings about Flick already. What car is it you drive again? A Nissan Almera, 1.8 SE, 15 years old, and as reliable as a coal-powered dildo. I replied with the flicker of a silent smile. Ah, well, Brett continued. I always thought buses were underrated. Things continued in this manner for weeks, when suddenly Brett stopped calling. There hadn't been more than 2 days when we hadn't spoken over a period of 3 months, but now he had vanished. I tried to reach his phone a number of times, but it seemed that the line had been deactivated. Just as I began to worry in earnest, I received a call from Brett explaining that he had met a girl down at a soup kitchen in Enfield. He responded when I quizzed him about his new flame. She was down there helping out last Monday, and when I walked over and talked to her, I've never had the balls to just walk up to a woman before. She started telling me about herself and we really hit it off. She makes me really happy. He texted me a picture, and she truly was beautiful. I found myself ambivalent towards the news. I was glad, obviously, that Brett had found someone that could make life worth living, but at the same time, I began to feel that he was being taken away from me. He called less and less, to the point where I worried that he no longer needed me. 2 weeks drifted by without any word from Brett. I presumed he was off with his new girlfriend. I punctured the humdrum of the days by fielding more calls from strangers, short and sweet, others protracted and dull. I gained a couple more jumpers. I even found myself a stalker for a brief time until he was sanctioned. However, nothing could shake Brett from the back of my mind. It was as though I had lost a significant part of me, almost as quickly as I had gained it. That is, until I got a text in the dead of the night from an unknown number. It's me, things have gone bad. Can we talk? My heart started pounding. Even though no name came with the message, I knew that this was Brett reaching out to me again. Hardly anybody texted me anymore, let alone at 3 a.m. Bleary-eyed, I tapped back. What happened? Are you injured? Where have you been all this time? The last response was my passive aggression surfacing, wanting him to feel remorseful over ignoring me after I helped him out so much over the last few months. Within seconds of the message leaving my phone, I received a reply. I can't do this anymore. I've been scared of this for too long, but it's the only thing left to do. I'm here. You know where I mean. With that, I felt energized yet completely blank. Rivulets of adrenaline coursed through every nerve of my body. In my mind's eye, I saw the multi-story that Brett had painted so vividly in my head. Those hours of conversations that had centered around this subject, I could only imagine how terrified he must be feeling. My phone buzzed with yet another message. Don't come. I was already halfway through the door when I read Brett's futile request. There was no way I was going to allow him to be alone. Not for this. I had to talk to him to make him see some sort of sense. It was a 20-minute drive to the outskirts of the borough, but I managed to make it in just under 15. The roads were deserted and the night was eerily calm, with a sense of foreboding befitting the occasion. I pulled up and slammed on the handbrake and was greeted by a huge oblast of night black concrete. Like so many of the structures in this destitute part of town, it was in worrying need of repair, and it was certainly not a place that deserved to be a person's final resting place, especially not Brett. I chose to walk the level so as to not scare him with the sound of the engine. My cardio isn't what it should be, so I was out of breath when I reached the top. The entire place was empty, but the silence deafened. Tentatively, I pushed open the heavy metal door to the final level, but when I arrived, I saw nothing. Search all I could, but there was no sign of Brett, nor any evidence that he had been there at all. My sense of panic had heightened. He had not yet jumped because I would have seen him on the pavement, but he definitely wasn't here. It took 3 circuits of the entire complex for me to confirm it. I tried to reach Brett's phone, but all I got was a deadline. I could only conclude that I'd somehow got the wrong place. Resigning myself to defeat, I exited the building and was just reaching my car when I received a text from a number that flashed as unknown. Check the trunk. Time stamped at 3:49 a.m. The message gave no indication as to who it may be from, but it could only be from someone that had watched me enter the car park. Nervously, I raked up and down the streets for any sign of disturbance, but there was truly nobody about. My car showed no sign of tampering. I tentatively drew the keys from my pocket and slipped into the boot lock. It turned with a loud click and popped open, the smallest encouragement. My face opened in shock and I mouthed a scream that did not come forth as sound. There, lying a few feet below, was the discolored corpse of a beautiful, awfully familiar woman, Brett's girlfriend. I stood dumbfounded at the macabre sight, holding my gaze. The woman, naked, could have been mistaken for being asleep, except for her distinct purple coloring. I remained standing when suddenly I was aware that my feet were lead. Whatever I tried, I could not move from the scene. When suddenly a new text message reached my phone, from the same number as the text a few minutes before. The police are on their way to your location as we speak. You can choose freedom or incarceration. I say you have 5 minutes. To this day, I do not know what made me get in that car and race away at breakneck speed. It could have only been that I panicked, but the panic cost me one chance at setting everything right. Before I knew it, I was sat outside my door, my trunk filled with the remains of a woman I did not know. Without knowing what else to do, I dialed the number of the person who had been sending me such cryptic messages. The line was answered in seconds. "Hello, James," came a voice I did not recognize, cool yet devoid of any warmth. "Who the fuck is this?" I replied, but portraying more fear than I'd hoped. "It's your only choice of redemption. I've been watching you for a while now, for longer than you would believe. I've seen some of the things you've done. Before you begun to preach to others how they should live their lives, you derive pleasure from giving sanctimonious advice to lost souls. You do this for your own selfish greed, not for the betterment of their lot. I've seen some of the terrible things you did before you became a hypocrite. You've been a bad boy, James." My mind raced instantly back to that night. The road was wet, the rain was heavy. The night grew darker than I had remembered. My mind was hazy with drink that night. I shouldn't have drove. I remember the sickening thud as her body crashed over my bonnet. I remember the sting of their tears as I panicked and sped from the collision, tracking her tender blood into the tracks in the road. I remember checking my rearview mirror and still seeing her still twitching frame growing smaller. "I own you now, James," came the cold voice in my ear. "From now on, until I decide otherwise, you will follow my every instruction. You will do everything I say, and when I say it, no more, no less. You will tell nobody. I am your God now. I will bury you if you stray from the line." I could think of nothing else to do other than to utter, "Brett, is that you?" A mirthless laugh rang high in reply. "I am an agent of death, and death does not like to be cheated out of what is his. And since that day I have been answering the summonses. Where he has told me to go, I have gone, never questioning, never daring to refuse, to fear of what may surface, for fear of what my own destruction and annihilation. I just blindly follow with trepidation in my heart, stalking death's next victims. Pray for my soul."